Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm really excited about this class today. We're going to dive deep into the 19th Amendment, the history of how this amendment got its roots and its energy and was passed in 1920s, and then what was still left to be done after that. Now, if you have questions during class, we know that we love questions. So use the chat or use the Q&A, ask all the questions that you want, and we will weave them in the class as we go. Or like we did last class, we'll hold an after class Q&A session for all the questions we didn't get to. It's going to be about 30 minutes today. We will be recording it and we'll send it back out to you after we're done on Saturday to make sure you get every resource you want from the week. So I'm not going to be alone on this, thank goodness. I am with Tom Donnelly. He's one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center, and he's excited to tell us all these stories. So Tom, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I can't wait to get into these stories.
So Tom, there's so many things that we want to go through, but like kind of just giving you some like big tasks, big to-do lists with big questions. We want to know a lot about the 19th Amendment, what it says, how it's connected to other voting amendments, and then who are some of the key figures in this fight? And I know that it's going to be a lot of different people over different time periods because this took a long time to happen. But we also wanted to talk about things like the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments. I always feel like I'm much of that one. And then what about how does federalism in the 19th Amendment work? And then finally, after it was ratified, what was the work that was left undone that didn't really kind of fully embrace the 19th Amendment until the 1960s? So all of that together is what we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes. Shall we start with the actual text of the Constitution?
Always, Kerry, always. And so here's the amazing text of the 19th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And then Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So just a few things to keep in mind as we're reading this text. One, we have to remember that the original Constitution left elections and voting largely to the states. And so if we're thinking about the Constitution before the 19th Amendment, the Constitution of 1788, 1789, the early years, the votings and elections were largely questions for the states. But if we're thinking of the longer, the broader American constitutional story, the 19th Amendment is a key part of it. Because one of the things we do over a series of amendments is that we write more and more protections for voting rights into our Constitution. And so one way to think about this is that we bring more and more groups into the we, the people that count for American democracy. This is how Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg put it in a famous opinion for the Supreme Court. But if we look at, for instance, the 15th Amendment began this constitutional transformation by writing protections against racial discrimination in voting into the Constitution. And then fast forwarding ahead to the 26th Amendment, we did it also based on discrimination for age. And the 19th Amendment is the middle part of this story, where we write new protections banning discrimination in voting on account of sex. But it's the big story. The big story here is a voting rights story where we're expanding more and more protections to more and more groups over time. But as we'll learn today, Kerry, this doesn't happen automatically. This isn't easy. This takes years upon years upon years of arguing and organizing and debating and everything else to finally get that text that we just read. And the text itself, a few things are worth noting there as well, now that we have that context. One is that the text, that first part, the right of the citizens of the United States to vote, that first part all the way to on account of sex, largely the 19th Amendment's framers were drawing on the language of the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment is almost identical to the 19th Amendment, except with the 19th Amendment, the framers there took race, color, or previous condition of servitude out of the 15th Amendment and put sex in there instead. So that where the 15th Amendment is banning racial discrimination in voting, the 19th Amendment is banning sex discrimination in voting. And then the other big thing there is that both of them share what we call an enforcement clause, which is that Congress shall have power to enforce the protections in this provision of the Constitution. And so a way to think about this is if the original Constitution was about giving power to the states on elections and voting, the 15th and 19th Amendment are giving the national government more power to protect the voting rights of certain groups. So it's a way of rebalancing power between the nation, the national government, and the states. It's not to say the national government now has all the power, but it is to say that the national government has more power than it did before, and will continue to battle over the meaning of federalism and the amount of power that goes to the national government versus the states when it comes to elections and voting. And so I'll sort of pause there, Kerry.
And I think that's a great foundation. So if we think about that original Constitution saying, okay, the job of voting, we're going to leave that up to the states and give that foundation there. It's almost like these three amendments put almost a bar up. Okay, you still have the power to run the election the way you want, but you must ensure that you cannot ban A, B, or C based on race, based on sex, based on age, so that those federal alignments say, sure, you still have power, but you cannot step on these areas. You cannot infringe these groups of people. So I love the kind of way that we're looking at it, but as we kind of understand it, and voting is so tricky. I mean, it's fascinatingly tricky because of that federalism component, but also because of this understanding that so much of what we think of as American engagement and action is the vote. But would you say we started kind of in a more narrow way as who could vote, and then throughout the years just been expanding and spreading out the kind of enfranchisement of all people?
Yeah, I think the two ways to think about it are, one, yeah, we see American democracy expanding over time to more groups. And then the constitutional thing is that what we're telling the states are, you still have a lot of power, but you now can no longer keep people from voting for these reasons. And the reasons get more and more plentiful over time, which bring more and more people power to exercise their vote at the ballot box.
Awesome. And I love that you use the word power with vote, because that's, the women behind me in our exhibit are saying we want the vote so we are able to have voice, agency, and power. So let's start with, where did women start? So if we think about like colonial time period around the Constitution, what was it like? What kind of rights and privileges and power did women have at this time period?
Yeah, so let's just start with the original Constitution. We're in the early Republic. And so, as we just said, states are given broad power over elections and voting. What do they do with it? What do they do with this power? Well, the vast majority of states limit voting rights in early America to white male property holders. That's not to say that was true in every state, but broadly speaking, the rule that applies in most places is that you need to be a white male property holder to vote. And so in this sense, women are excluded from this rule that applies in most states. But notice who else is excluded from this rule. In most states, African Americans are excluded more broadly, but also poor white males are as well. So white males that don't own property also cannot vote. So there's a large category of people that aren't able to vote in early America. But that changes pretty quickly with this amazing, so one, actually, before we even get there, let's say there were exceptions to this. Maybe the most notable exception is my home state of New Jersey, which allowed—
brag about New Jersey again.
Yeah, exactly, right? which allowed unmarried female landowners the right to vote in state and local elections from 1776 to 1807. So unmarried women landowners could vote in New Jersey until 1807, but New Jersey then ended that experiment pretty quickly. Then again in 1807, saying that the vote will only go to, quote, free white male citizens. And so what we end up seeing as we skip ahead here, Kerry, to the 1820s, 1830s, into what we would call Jacksonian America, is that we do see an expansion of voting rights during this period. And it's a move towards what we call universal white male suffrage. And so what this means is that if at the beginning of the Republic, many poor white males without property were excluded from the vote, in the Jacksonian era, they are brought into the vote. So states are getting rid of property requirements for men and allowing poor white men to vote. But this does not help women. It doesn't help African Americans. It doesn't help all sorts of other groups. And so this is where we see an expansion of voting rights to all white men, but other groups are going to have to continue fighting for those rights over time. And so it's right here as we get into the mid 1800s where we see more and more activism by women's rights activists. We see conventions, we see petitions, we see writings in newspapers and speeches delivered. So we see women and their allies beginning to use all of the tools of the First Amendment to try to push for reform. And maybe the best way to frame this is, let's go to 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention. This isn't the only example of a convention.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kerry.
Just one question before we get there, because David asked a great question. So why about elections and why the power of elections is so based in the states? So, and we know it's because of federalism, giving the power back to the states to run the election. But what's the reasoning behind it? Why did the Constitution leave elections and voting to the states, Is it a simple concern as to manage the large government power? Or is there a reasoning about the states being more connected to the people and they would drive it better for the state level? So
Well,
before
I
we
think
jump into this.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's two things. For some, it's a concern about not trusting a distant national government, and so afraid that national officials would use national voting rules to stack the deck in their own favor, and so that incumbents would just keep winning and winning and winning, and we just have some distant national elite in the national government. What is connected with what you said, Kerry, too, is that for so many members of the founding generation, they were most closely connected to their states. They thought that the best way in which their rights would be protected, their power would be exercised, would be in connection with decisions made by their state and local governments. And so therefore they wanted such a fundamental thing like voting, like the core of representation, to be held by their states.
Okay, one more question, and I promise I'll let you go on to Seneca Falls.
Yeah.
Great question from a student in the East Lee County School. To what extent does the lack of voting and the idea around poll taxes and literacy tests have to do with women's ability to own inherent property since the beginning of the country? So that's really wrapped into two pieces, but I love that what you're thinking there. How much is voting really just one part of women having rights and having rights to their stuff, their children, themselves?
Yeah, and that's such a great question and a great frame for Seneca Falls too, because we need to understand this push for the right to vote, which again, in 1848, that's the most radical thing in many ways that the women's rights activists are pushing for from the perspective of other Americans, but they're fighting for all sorts of different rights during this period. The right to own property, so the right for married women to own property, for them to be able to contract, to sue and to be sued. And so they're fighting back against all these rules in the economy, in the home, that stack the deck in favor of their husbands and against themselves. And the broader system here, and maybe it's hard for us to get into this mindset because it's so different from how we think today, but why is it that this was seen as so radical? Why especially was the right to vote? Why wasn't it self-evidently true that women should have it? If there's no taxation without representation, if that's what the revolution's about, how can we justify excluding women? And I think to get into the worldview of the time, what people who opposed women's suffrage, let's say in the mid-1800s, what they were thinking is, one, our society is organized around the household. It's organized around men, traditionally being the heads of the household. The men, so it's this traditional view that there are separate spheres for men and women. Women are moral, they're pure, they're going to take care of the home, and that men are the rest of it, the dirty work of politics and economics and work, that's going to largely be left to men. And as related to voting, the idea was that men would virtually represent their household in politics. So they'd represent the views of their wives, of their daughters, et cetera, when they go to the ballot box. And so there is representation. It's not direct representation, but they're virtually represented by their husbands. And the last one was there was this idyllic image of the family as the foundation of the American Republic, and that it was a harmonious system where everyone had their proper role and that there wasn't conflict, and that the family unit itself was it was unified. And the thought was, if you inject politics into it, where you allow women to vote and men to vote, you would see increased conflict in the home and greater discord all throughout the Republic. And so it's all of that together is justifying keeping women away from the polls. But women are pushing back. They want beginning to push for equal rights at home, at work, and at the ballot box. And so you see some waves of victories here around. So Seneca Falls is 1848. We're also seeing big wins for married women getting different property rights, contract rights, et cetera, including the Married Women's Property Act of 1848, which was a huge victory in New York, expanding those sorts of rights to women. And so women are winning there, but women are beginning to push on this new frontier, saying that's fine. We really do want all of those rights, but we want the right to vote too. And so with Seneca Falls, what we get here is it's organized by these two great suffragists, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's a gathering in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. There's around 300 people there. And so the big document, the big thing to remember from the Seneca Falls Convention, and organizes a lot of what they're asking for, is the Declaration of Sentiments, which was authored by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I urge you, go online, find this document, read it. It's an amazing document, because what Stanton does is she takes the Declaration of Independence and she rewrites it. she rewrites it here. She has these famous words to open the Declaration of Sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Isn't that great? It's just an amazing, she's laying claim to the deepest principles of the American Republic and saying we women deserve equal rights as well. And the Declaration of Independence has complaints against the British Crown, the King, and here what Stanton does is she has complaints against men for their oppressive treatment, for oppressive laws that we see in the States. And what they write into the Declaration of Sentiments are 12 demands, and they include equal education, equal pay, property rights, and then I love that quote, the quote unquote sacred right to the elective franchise. And so here, what they're laying out in the Declaration of Sentiments is their vision of what an more equal America would look like. And from here, we'd see additional conventions. So just 2 years later in Massachusetts, there's a national convention for women's rights that attracts 1,000 attendees. And then we also begin to see increased organization and increased advocacy among African-American women too. Seneca Falls, it's a lot of elite white women. We see Frederick Douglass was there, was at Seneca Falls as well. But we see the coalition of people pushing for women's suffrage becoming more diverse into the 1850s and onward. And I'll sort of pause there before we get to the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Yeah, I think, and going back to these kind of Declaration of Sentiments, just to be like, this is the advanced class, so we can dive into this a little deeper. We see this alignment between women's right to vote, African Americans' right to vote, 14th Amendment. All this is kind of leading up to these big major amendments, but also the 18th Amendment and the tolerance movement to end drinking in America. But when we think about these rights to have equal education, pay, property rights, what we have to understand is one of the awful predicaments so many women were in with violence at the home from alcoholism, no ability to leave your home, to take anything with you, take your children, or have any way to really protect yourself. So can we just kind of like open that up a little to talk about like, this is a dire straits for many women in America, that they have to stay in these violent situations because they have no rights to gain their freedom elsewhere.
Well, that's absolutely right. And what's so interesting about that, Kerry, is as we get to this period and in the decades to come, this is a main way in which the suffragists turn the argument about virtual representation on its head. So if the big theory why women shouldn't be able to vote is that their husbands represent them, what women increasingly say is, well, look at how many of us are treated in the home. Look at how we're all trapped into this, sometimes really bad situations. Look at the laws on the books. Does it really seem like the state legislatures and Congress are looking out for us? And so all of those sorts of things build into their argument for why rooting it in the need to be represented in government and make sure your views are represented in what the government's doing is feeding into this push towards women's suffrage. The other thing, and this is a great, I think, transition to the Civil War and Reconstruction, is the suffragists, it's not just its own isolated movement. So the suffragists are involved in all of these great reform movements in the mid 1800s. Part of it is women's suffrage. Part of it is what you said, Kerry, the push towards temperance, trying to cut down or eliminate drinking in American society and all the harms that brought. Part of it was the push to end slavery. And so, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, they were all suffragists and fighting against slavery at the same time. And so there was a great alliance between suffragists and abolitionists pushing for broad reform and envisioning a better America. I'll pause there.
I was going to say, and okay, so now, Tom, I'll let you jump into the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. You got like 2 minutes. Go for it. Tom loves Reconstruction, so I always have to give him a box.
So Reconstruction, it's this great era after the Civil War where we as a nation have to figure out, what are we going to look like now that this war is over? What constitutional baselines do we have to set? What does the promise of freedom and equality we talked about all the way back in the Declaration, what does it mean on the ground today? And for which groups, for which people in the United States? And so during this period, we see this early phase of great optimism from the suffragists, from the abolitionists. What they're looking at is, we just won a civil war. We just abolished slavery, just the most amazing reform they could have ever possibly imagined. If we've used the national government to do that, why can't we push for universal rights, universal voting rights for everyone? And so you see suffragists and abolitionists joining together and saying that what equality in America after the Civil War has to mean, it has to mean voting rights for women and for African Americans, both. And so this vision unified African-American and white reformers. So that for them, the question of voting wasn't about race, it wasn't about sex, it was about Reconstruction's promise of equality for everybody. And so I think that one of the great examples of this is the suffragist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who she's this amazing figure during the period. She was an African-American born free. She was educated in Baltimore. Prior to the Civil War, she's an active abolitionist speaker. And so she's a poet, active reformer, and she speaks at this Universal Rights Convention in 1866, which had all the famous people you could possibly imagine right there. And she's one of the prime speakers. And here's her vision of universal rights in America. She says, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving a curse in its own soul." What a powerful vision that in the end, what America has to mean after the Civil War is we're going to stand up for those without power, and we're going to increase the power of the weak, regardless of their race, their sex, or anything else. And so there's this period, this push towards universal suffrage, but all too quickly, the movement fractures. Because the Republican Party, they're in charge. They're the party of Lincoln, of Union. They just won the Civil War. And they have to say, what are we actually going to do here? And so they ratify a series of transformational amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. But in these amendments, they prioritize African Americans over women. And so here's one example right here in the 14th Amendment, Section 2. We see the word male written into the Constitution for the first time we're bringing sex into the Constitution. And it's meant to protect the voting rights of African American men. But the suffragists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, see immediately the danger here. And she's saying, this is going to take us, if we write this into the Constitution, it's a barrier to women's rights, and it's going to take us another 50 years at least to get it out of there. And so we see this fracture in the suffragist movement. We see the National Women's Suffrage Association with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They oppose the 15th Amendment. They say, no, don't prioritize African Americans. Do women's suffrage first. If you don't, we're going to oppose this amendment. And what we're going to do is we're going to push for a national amendment for women's suffrage. And you can understand their frustration with the Republican Party, but we also see increasingly, more and more racist appeals feed into some of these arguments as well. So we see racial divisions in the suffrage movement, but we also see other suffragists like Lucy Stone, like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, like Frederick Douglass say, we support the 15th Amendment. We're going to keep pushing for universal rights. So you can be for the 15th Amendment and for women's suffrage. But in the end, what we see here is it's an early defeat for women's suffrage in the Reconstruction Congress, but women immediately, and you see here, Victoria Woodhull is a great example of this, women immediately say, look, we'll take the Constitution as you just ratified it. It still protects women's right to vote. Because what it says in the 14th Amendment is that no state can abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. We women are citizens of the United States. What privilege is more fundamental as a national right than the right to vote? So we have the right to vote. It's in the Constitution already. You see Victoria Woodhull's quote, "I do now claim that I am equally with men possessed of the right to vote." She's an important suffragist during the time. She becomes the first woman to testify before a US House committee, arguing that Congress, you need to pass a law saying that women have the right to vote. You have authority under the 14th Amendment to do it. Now do it. Congress doesn't do it. And then you see Virginia Minor, who I saw Kerry flash her picture up on the screen too, in this amazing movement known as the New Departure, where women are trying to vote in elections. Some are able to do it, including Susan B. Anthony. She's eventually arrested and fined for doing it. What women argue is the same thing Victoria Woodhull was, which is the 14th Amendment protects the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Courts, if states are denying women the right to vote, say that those laws are unconstitutional. So Virginia Minor says this in a case called Minor v. Happersett. It's the first big voting rights case before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says unanimously in an opinion by Chief Justice Morrison Waite, Virginia Minor, you're wrong. Women do not have the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. You are US citizens, but the right to vote is not a privilege or immunity of US citizenship. And so women have to regroup and figure out a new way to find the right to vote.
And they take to the streets. So I was going to move us forward a little bit, almost to like what I always think of like the second giant wave of female activists kind of pushing for the right to vote, and the processions, the parades, and the protests. And I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of the women's suffrage procession and Ida B. Wells, who is one of my favorite, like I've known her for a while, but just the more and more I read, she's one of my top favorites.
Yeah, no, she's an unbelievably courageous figure, both in the suffragist cause, but also the cause for African-American equality. she's one of the founders of the NAACP. She has this, she is one of the, or maybe the key figure that exposes the evils of violence against African Americans in the South in the late 1800s, early 20th century. And so she's this amazing figure in both of those movements. So yeah, you're right, Kerry.
And she pushes it internationally too. She goes
Oh,
out.
yes.
It's amazing, her work.
Yeah.
Sorry, we have a class just on her next.
Yeah, exactly. But so what we see is, so women, they lose as we're crafting the Reconstruction amendments and in those arguments after. But we see women then push in two different directions as we get into the 20th century. So the late 1800s and into the 20th century. One is what you see here, which is women increasingly using their First Amendment rights to challenge national leadership and place women's suffrage on the national agenda. So we see something here like the women's suffrage procession in Washington, D.C. in 1913. It's right around the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. And it's the first big parade where you're bringing in 5,000 women from around the country to march from the Capitol all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. They're met with violence. Many of them end up in the hospital. And so it ends up being national headlines and ends up increasing public support for women's suffrage and public sympathy. The other part of it, though, is the Ida B. Wells story, which is a much darker part. But it reminds us of divisions by race within the suffrage movement into the 20th century, which is that there are many African-American women who come to march in this procession, and they're told to march in the back of the parade. And so you see the leaders, you see fractures in the suffrage movement over race. There wound up being 4 state delegations that were integrated and marched. And you have Ida B. Wells, who was like, all right, I'll quickly go to the back. But as soon as this parade starts, she joins her Illinois delegation and marches arm in arm with the other suffragists from her state, denying the suffragist leaders of this parade the power to send her to the back of the line, saying that no, this is still a project that needs to be won, pushing for the voting rights of all women, regardless of their race. So Ida B. Wells is an amazing example of that. But the other, I saw you flash to this amazing image too, which is, this is an example also during this period. This is 1917 now, so it's shortly after Woodrow Wilson's reelection. We see Alice Paul and the National Women's Party pushing for protests at the White House. Now, this may seem like, what's the big deal? Well, this is the first major protest we're ever seeing at the White House. This was a radical move.
Just remember that, ladies. First protest at the White House ever. That was the women. So you're welcome. Get back to you, Doug.
Yeah, and so it's this really cool thing where what you end up seeing on many of their signs are these old arguments of, no taxation without representation. Government is based on the consent of the governed. These old ideas going all the way back to the founding, but it's women standing there fighting for women's suffrage, protesting in front of the White House. Initially, Woodrow Wilson is kind of, amused, I think, by it. He would wave to the protesters. He himself was a great fence sitter when it came to women's suffrage, didn't want to embrace the national amendment. But Alice Paul and her allies said, no, we have to push Woodrow Wilson. We have to push the members of Congress to support a women's suffrage amendment. And then we enter World War I. And with that, we see a repression of free speech broadly by the Wilson administration. This included the Wilson administration beginning to arrest these protesters in front of the White House. They'd be taken to jails. They were treated really, really poorly. And these stories alone, women kept protesting anyway in front of the White House. And these stories of the suffering of women in the hands of the government, again, continue to grow support for the women's suffrage amendment. The last part I'll put on the table here, Kerry, is that this also wasn't happening in a vacuum. If we extend back to the late 1800s, we also have a whole different set of reformers pushing state by state to secure women's right to vote. So these protests were largely directed at trying to have a national amendment, but state by state, we see states beginning to give women full voting rights. It begins out west with the Wyoming territory in the late 1860s. Then when Wyoming becomes a state in the 1880s, it gives women the full right to vote. We see multiple Western states giving women full voting rights until by 1917, big states like New York gave women full voting rights, and Michigan in 1918. And so even before we ratify the 19th Amendment, women have full voting rights in 15 states. This goes back to Justice Louis Brandeis's famous image of the states as the laboratories of democracy. The idea here being for the reformers, if we can try new policies, new ideas in the states, show that they work, maybe we can adopt it as a nation. And that's in many ways, that's what we did with the 19th Amendment. And
And
so, yes, yeah,
I
I'm sorry.
love this add-on by Jasmine in the chat. So also women were holding jobs while men were away at war, which also showed why they should be allowed to vote and moving away from this patriotic idea. I'm not saying the word right. The patriarch, like smashing the patriarch. Absolutely. That, you know, they've been saying it since Hattie Stanton, that taxation without representation. Women were working all along, but this is even more in your face on top of it. We are a part of this workforce. We are a part of the war effort. We need to have the vote for these wars as well. So very similar, kind of almost like mantra around that for the 26th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, but we can't end on, okay, 19th Amendment's passed, check, all women get the right to vote. There is unbelievable amount of work for this that has to keep going on. So what happens to the group, the suffragist movement? What happens after this? Do they fracture? Is it the African American leaders that move forward and say, okay, so white women were able to vote with that, but still there's poll tax, there's literacy tests, there's all these ways to suppress the vote based on race that is stopping the women's right to vote for all the women?
Yeah, so there is a great debate in the movement, what next? So in the election of 1920 is the first that's held under the 19th Amendment, and many, 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 many women vote in that election. They elect Woodrow Wilson, Warren Harding. And so, you know, that happens, but you're right. Millions of women of color aren't able to vote. And it's because the same rules that are applying to African-American men apply to them. And sadly, many of their white suffragist allies don't join them in the cause of making the 19th Amendment a reality for women of color. And so what happens is that African-American women have to join arms with African-American men and continuing to fight state by state, continuing to fight back against Jim Crow laws that discriminate against African-Americans, against intimidation, against violence. And so we see decades upon decades. What is it? So 1920 is when the 19th Amendment's ratified. It's not given its full life until 1965. With the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it takes another 4 decades or more of advocacy to breathe life into the 15th and 19th Amendment and make voting rights equality, a reality for African-American men and African-American women. And so with the Voting Rights Act, finally, Congress passes a strong voting rights law using its enforcement powers under the Constitution, especially under the 15th Amendment that ends racial discrimination in voting, to finally have strong enough medicine to attack the Jim Crow laws and try to give equal access to the ballot box. And it almost immediately really works to increase African-American voter participation to humongous levels that we hadn't seen since the beginning of Reconstruction. And the Supreme Court says in a case called South Carolina versus Katzenbach in 1866, yes, this is a transformation in the relationship between the national government and the states when it comes to voting, but yes, it's constitutional. That's what we meant with the 15th Amendment. That's what we meant by promising equality in voting. And finally, Congress has this power and they are using it.
And I always say, like, finally using Section 2, when they wrote that, the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, they put it in there for a purpose. So now we're using it. And now the courts are supporting it too, because that's the other thing we need to look at. A lot of these amendments were chipped away at by the courts. So they played a role in this. Congress not using the Section 2, but then, or I guess it's Section 2 of 15th as well.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, Section 2, and the courts chipping away at these. So everybody working together to move this forward. Anything else you kind of want us to wrap up with when we understand and looking at the women's right to vote today?
Well, no, I mean, I think in the end, Kerry, it's just the 19th Amendment is a reminder that constitutional reform often takes decades and decades and decades of hard work. And it often takes a combination, as we saw with women of color, of winning a constitutional amendment, but also working hard and getting the government to have the tools to actually enforce those promises. And so constitutional reform it's very hard. And the last thing, Kerry, is that the 19th Amendment, again, is part of this broader story of constitutional reform we see across American history, reading together the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments, this story of bringing more and more groups into the we the people that count in American democracy, giving more and more groups protections from discrimination in voting.
And what a fascinating kind of way to look at that and think about this kind of the funnel of voting opening up wider and wider. And then what are these modern questions around this today? So what a great end there. Thank you so much, Tom. This was a great class, really fun and interesting way. And students, thank you for your great questions and additions in the comments as well. We love when you add to the storyline.